In 1994, the fighting game craze was at an all-time high, and developers were scrambling for ways to stand out against Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. Atari Games answered by ditching human fighters entirely, releasing a post-apocalyptic stop-motion brawler with giant dinosaurs and surprisingly deep gameplay mechanics. What's going on, everybody? Steve here with another episode of Arcade Economy, the series where we take a look at arcade games to determine just how much they cost to beat and how fair they were to our wallets. Last time on Arcade Economy, we foiled Dr. Doom's plans for world domination in Sega's Spider-Man the video game. Today, we are battling for supremacy of Earth in Atari's Primal Rage. Did Primal Rage offer a dynamite experience, or was this game just a predator looking to render your allowance extinct? That's what we're here to find out. Let's head back to the early 90s. Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat had exploded onto the arcade scene, ushering in a generation of fighting games that would take the video game market by storm. Naturally, every game publisher wanted a piece of the action. Atari Games initially tried their hand at a robot-themed brawler called Cyberstorm, but after a rough development cycle and poor location tests, the project was scrapped. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. They were still looking for a fighter, though. During an annual company brainstorming session, Atari animator Jason Leong pitched the idea of a head-to-head fighting game where giant prehistoric beasts would battle across a post-apocalyptic Earth. To get buy-in from the rest of the team, Leong and programmer Dennis Harper put together a quick prototype. They took a copy of the 1969 Ray Harryhausen dinosaur movie, The Valley of Gwengi, cut out still frames of the creatures, and animated them fighting each other on screen. That rough demo was enough to convince Atari to officially greenlight the project, and so the team got to work on their new game. Now, surprisingly enough, Primal Rage wasn't the very first dinosaur fighting game. In fact, a very similar game that Primal Rage took inspiration from came out 2 years earlier in 1992, and that game was Dino Rex from Taito. Dino Rex never really made it in the arcade scene due to its really poor gameplay mechanics, and it's also worth noting that it never released in the States. It's widely criticized as one of the worst fighting games of its time due to its poor controls and heavy learning curve. So yeah, even though it's abundantly clear that Primal Rage took heavy inspiration from Dino Rex, this really was the blueprint of what not to do when making a dino fighter. Atari decided against using pixel art, instead opting for digitized photos of practical stop-motion animation. This process was similar to how Mortal Kombat games captured their sprites, and was even used by Midway for fighters like Goro and Kintaro. Dino Rex also used stop-motion dinosaur models, albeit nowhere near as detailed as Primal Rage would. Atari spent around $50,000 just to design and build the physical rubber puppets with flexible metal armatures underneath. For those of you doing the math at home, that's $114,000 adjusted for today's money in 2026. And honestly, you can kind of see why they were so expensive. These models are filled with detail and look fantastic, even by today's standard. Because the in-house team didn't have much experience with stop motion, Atari hired Hollywood special effects veterans to get the job done. This included model maker Dan Platt, who had worked on Terminator 2 and Gremlins 2, and legendary stop motion animator Pete Kleinow, who worked on The Empire Strikes Back. The team photographed each puppet frame by frame, capturing over 400 frames of animation per fighter, which were then carefully selected to give the game that smooth cinematic movement. Then in August 1994, Primal Rage finally hit arcade floors and went on to become a mammoth hit. You see what I did there? On top of this game looking great and being, in my opinion, a really solid fighter, I do think that much of Primal Rage's success came from timing. Jurassic Park had released just a year earlier, and the world was entranced with Dino Fever. It wasn't long before the game made its way over to practically every home console, being ported to the SNES, Sega Genesis, Game Boy, Game Gear, 3DO, Amiga, 32X, PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and even Atari's own ill-fated Jaguar CD. While many of the home ports were acceptable, none of them had the space required to match the performance of the arcade. But the game itself wasn't the only thing reeling in the dough for Atari games. Most people forget just how popular Primal Rage actually was.
Get ready to erupt into Primal Rage. But be warned, these guys don't just kick butt, they slam it, crush it, and trash it. And now they're even bigger. 4 tasty follower figures take a bite out of their killer appetite. Now even more rage is in your hands with Primal Rage and Super Rage action figures from Playmates.
Atari reportedly made more of its money from Primal Rage merchandise than it did from the game itself. It wasn't long before Primal Rage hit toy stores with action figures, comic books, trading cards, and even a projector. A sequel, Primal Rage 2, was planned but never made its way across the finish line. Well, not officially anyway. In 1996, Atari confirmed that Primal Rage 2 had been in production and would release later that year. They even greenlit a budget of $2.5 million for Primal Rage 2, which was a lot for an arcade game in the mid-90s. Atari Games market research had told them that even though the first game was popular among many arcade goers, it was more of a casual fighter, with the hardcore fighting game players steering clear of the game. So, in order to try and appease both player bases, Atari Games decided to move the game in a new direction with, giant humans. Don't worry though, you can still morph into your favorite beast from the original, or hold up on the character select screen to unlock them. The game was shaping up to be bigger and better than the original. However, production came to a crawl due to all the stop-motion work needed for the new fighters. And in 1996, Midway Games bought the rights to Atari Games. And since Midway already owned Mortal Kombat, one of Primal Rage's direct competitors, they had no ambition of completing the game, and thus it was shut down and cancelled. The game had a lot of improvements over the original, and if Atari Games had the chance to complete it, I definitely think it could have surpassed the original in terms of fun, quality gameplay. And then in June of 2014, Galloping Ghost Arcade revealed that it had a working copy of Primal Rage 2 for play at their location in Illinois. It's considered to be one of only 2 arcade boards in existence, and if you ever visit the legendary arcade, you can play it today. Primal Rage 2 is still considered unfinished though, and thus is missing certain mechanics like character endings and balances. The game's unplayable ROM was also circulating online for a few years, and it wouldn't be until 2017 that it was finally made playable via emulation. If you are able to get your hands on the ROM, it is currently playable via the latest version of MAME. Now, most people would assume that Primal Rage takes place in the prehistoric past, but quite the contrary. In fact, the story for Primal Rage actually takes place on a post-apocalyptic version of Earth. Appropriately spelled Earth with a U, you know, the way a caveman would spell it. The story kicks off when a meteor strikes the planet, completely wiping out modern human civilization. The few humans that do survive are forced to regress back into primitive Stone Age-like tribes. The meteor strike also awakened 7 ancient supernatural beasts who had been slumbering beneath the planet's surface for eons. The Draconians. Now freed, these giant dinosaurs and primates are worshipped as literal gods by the surviving human tribes, and they immediately begin a brutal war for total planetary supremacy. The roster is split between 2 warring factions: virtuous beasts fighting to protect the planet and maintain ecological balance, and destructive beasts who want nothing more than to plunge the planet into eternal suffering for their own benefit. Among the virtuous beasts are Blizzard, the god of virtue, Armadon, the god of life, Sauron, the god of hunger, and Talon, the god of survival. The destructive beasts include Diablo, the god of evil, Vertigo, the goddess of insanity, and Chaos, the god of decay. If you manage to beat the arcade mode in single player, then you are treated to a unique ending depending on which character you choose, usually involving that god conquering Earth and shaping humanity in their own image. The Primal Rage cabinet features 8-way joysticks with 4 buttons: low quick attack, high quick attack, low fierce attack, and high fierce attack. The cabinet artwork is pretty cool. It's got a real volcanic style going for it with the Primal Rage logo on the sides and marquee. Upon entering your credits, you'll get to pick between one of the 7 gods, each with their own unique moveset and abilities. To differentiate itself from other fighters, Primal Rage had a pretty unique way of pulling off special moves. Rather than using half-circle inputs like Street Fighter or directional taps like Mortal Kombat, Primal Rage's special moves are pulled off by holding buttons down and then performing the directional inputs. This does make the learning curve for the game a bit harder to nail down. It also makes quicker moves like throws longer to pull off. For example, in any other fighter, most throws just involve getting close to your opponent and pushing towards them +1 button. But in Primal Rage, you'll have to hold a couple of buttons down and half-circle the joystick. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But beneath these weird controls, Primal Rage actually has some incredibly deep forward-thinking system mechanics. The game allowed for chain combos, letting players link quick attacks into fierce attacks, and even launching opponents for air juggles. This wasn't anything new for the time, but to keep things balanced, Atari did implement a no-cheese system. If the game detected you were using the same move too many times in a single combo, a little red circle with a slice of cheese crossed out would flash on the screen. Your combo would break, letting your opponent recover, and sometimes leaving you vulnerable to be punished. This was one of the earliest anti-infinite mechanics in fighting game history. Primal Rage was also one of the first games to highlight how many hits your combo pulled off, a mechanic that almost every fighting game does today. Different jump mechanics like super jumps, short hops, or jump cancels were also implemented into the game, allowing players to strategize how much pressure to put on their opponents. Atari added a stun meter too. Take too much consecutive damage, and the tiny brain icon at the top of the screen would overload, causing your beast to become dizzy and leaving you wide open for a free hit. You'll also notice the fighters being worshipped by followers. The longer your win streak, the more worshippers would appear in your next fight. And if you pulled off a sick combo, they'd come in and start praying to you, at which point you could eat them for bonus health. How freaking cool is that? The game does feature finishing moves, and while some of them are fun, most of them are just kind of bland in my opinion. I also want to mention that I love the aesthetic of this game. The health bars being hearts that would beat faster and eventually explode upon defeat, and the brains for the stun meter were a nice touch that you don't really see too much of out of fighting games from this time. After picking your character, a world map will appear and you'll need to conquer all of the different continents in order to complete the game. I do want to note that if you do lose and choose to continue, and you decide to change your character, all of the land you've conquered previously will reset, essentially starting you back from square one. So basically, if you're trying to beat this game, you need to pick a character and stick with them. I found this out the hard way. After conquering every continent, it's time to go through the final gauntlet. Don't worry though, you'll be given a chance to chow down on some of your worshippers for extra health. The final fight is an endurance match against every character in the game. If you lose all of your health, your extra life from the worshippers will kick in. Once that depletes, you'll get 15 seconds to continue, and if you choose to do so, you'll pick right up from where you left off. So good news, you won't have to start off from the beginning of the gauntlet. Now, I was very appreciative of this because if I had to beat every character in the game on just a couple bars of health, I honestly don't think I would have beaten the game. Now, I'm not sure I actually ever spent this much time with Primal Rage. I do remember enjoying the game when I was a kid, but then again, which kid wouldn't love a video game centered around fighting dinosaurs? But color me impressed, because as I was researching the game for this video, I never realized how much Primal Rage actually contributed to the fighting game genre, and I do think it is probably one of the most underrated fighters to ever exist. I do think the one thing holding it back though is those weird button inputs and its heavy learning curve. And now it's time to find out just how much I spent to beat Primal Rage. Now for these games, I play them on emulator on their default settings, and I set up a counter to increase every time that I start or continue the game. Now I do want to mention that for years, Primal Rage was very hard to emulate due to a security feature that encrypted its data, but over the past few years, it has become possible to emulate this game using a proprietary emulator called the Mu emulator. So that's what I used, and a shout out to the team behind that. When it was all said and done, and I finally beat Primal Rage, it took me 28 credits to complete, which factors out to $7 on 25-cent credits, or $14 on 50-cent credits. Now, had I realized that if I switched characters, it would send me all the way back to square one of the ladder, I think that this price would probably be a little bit lower. But hey, that's what happens when you're learning a game. Adjusting for inflation, and $7 in 1994 would feel like spending about $15.69 today. $14 in 1994 would become $31.38 today. It took me about an hour and 35 minutes to beat Primal Rage, which factors out to about 7 cents per minute on 25-cent credits, or 14 cents per minute on 50-cent credits. And when looking at other fighting games that I've done in this series so far, that is a little bit more on the lower side. There weren't any bosses in this game, just the endurance gauntlet at the end, and to get through that, it cost me 4 credits, or $1 on 25-cent credits, or $2 on 50-cent credits. And now it's time to bust out the predatory game scale to determine just how predatory Primal Rage was in stealing your money. Now, I definitely noticed some predatory practices with Primal Rage. I think that the learning curve is a little higher than other fighting games, and holding down the buttons, especially to do quick attacks and those like long inputs, can really be annoying. Now, all fighting games from this era input read to some certain extent, and I did notice this in Primal Rage, but it wasn't as nearly as bad as games like Mortal Kombat. I think the most apparent predatory mechanic in this game that I noticed was rubber banding, and that's when the CPU just goes from being really easy to really hard. There were many times that the first round I would easily beat the CPU, only to get steamrolled in round 2 and 3 thereafter. I even noticed my opponent becoming increasingly aggressive in the second half of the round, giving me the illusion that I was going to win the round, and then all of a sudden, they would just go all rage mode on me and just completely destroy me to win the fight. I also think that having to conquer every land with the same character in order to roll credits is a little bit ridiculous. I don't know of any other fighter that does this with their fighting game ladder. And I feel like if you're trying to learn a character, or if you're hitting a wall and you need to maybe switch things up to punish you to start from the beginning again, it just kind of sucks that you have to start from scratch every time. When I played, I started off with Blizzard, and I found that his moves were a little hard to pull off, so I switched to Talon, and then I found that I wasn't really getting enough power with Talon, and then I finally made it to Vertigo, and that was the character that I vibed with most and beat the game with. All in all, it's the learning curve, the weird long inputs, the rubber banding, and the inability to switch characters is what drives this up on the scale. So now let's talk a little bit about what brings this down on the scale. Primal Rage introduced a lot of new ideas for fighting games, some of which are still around today. In fact, I would even go as far as to say most of which are still around today. Not many fighters let you regain health mid-fight the way that Primal Rage does by eating your worshippers. Different jumps and move cancels and anti-cheesing mechanics are also used today in modern fighters. It's just a shame that most of these are really hard to pull off in Primal Rage. I also want to applaud the game for allowing players to quarter feed your way through that final gauntlet. If Primal Rage was a truly predatory game, then this option wouldn't even be available. Primal Rage does have some unfair practices, but is it the most predatory fighter I've played? No, far from it. I think its contributions to the fighting game genre as a whole often go overlooked, and 7 or 14 cents per minute to play through the game is pretty low for a fighter. So with all that in consideration, I'm giving Primal Rage a 6 out of 10 on the predatory game scale.
Rage.
Do you agree or disagree with my rating? Sound off in the comments below, and I will do my best to reply. Now, can you play Primal Rage today? Unfortunately, no, you cannot. A few years ago, it was included in a Midway Arcade Treasures game, but that's been out of print, so really the only way to play this is in the wild or through emulation. Next time on Arcade Economy, we're sticking with the dino theme for Cadillacs and dinosaurs, so be sure to check back for that video. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I always love exploring games that have a really big impact on the video game industry, and going into this, I had no idea that Primal Rage made this much of an impact for fighting games. So it's always fun when I'm researching these games and writing the script and making these discoveries. It's just a lot of really cool information that I really enjoyed learning about. Anyway, now to shout out our Patreon and YouTube producers. Thank you guys. You know who you are. Jake Weed, Tanner Trezza, Pezmage, John Forhan, Smash Jackson, Gregory Hines, The Badger Knight, and Novice Brad. Thank you guys for your support. As always, if you would like to support Mass Replay, you can do so by becoming a YouTube member or a patron on Patreon. At the VIP viewer level, you will get all of my videos early and ad-free, and you'll also get director's cut versions of Arcade Economy, plus exclusive members-only videos too. If you join at the producer level, you'll get your name shouted out at the end of each video, just like I did so earlier. But also, just you viewing these videos supports me, so thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and hopefully you'll see me on my next episode. Thanks for watching.